Shalom, Bruchim Abayim, and welcome to Shevi'im Panim LaTorah, to the 70 Faces of the Torah, and also Sulam Yaakov. This week's Torah portion is Parashat Shemini. Shemini refers to the 8th day, which is the day that the Mishkan or Tabernacle was inaugurated. Now, why is it referred to as the 8th day? Well, at the end of Parashat Sav, the Maftir section, we learned that Hashem commanded Moshe to inform Aharon and his sons that they should be isolated or quarantined, really a 7-day period of consecration, in order to establish the Mishkan. And so the 8th day is when they came out, and in Jewish thought, Shemini or 8 refers to like a new beginning, 7 refers to a cycle of completion, and also the inauguration began on Chodesh Nisan, the 1st of Nisan. I have subtitled this teaching, The Vindication of the Pig. Now, it's a very interesting title. What does it actually mean? Well, with God's help, we're going to actually learn the answer in this week's Torah portion. At the end of Parashat Shemini, the Torah warns us not to contaminate ourselves with non-kosher food. And the reason why we should avoid any impure sources of food is because Hashem has elevated us from the land of Mitzrayim. We read here in Vayikra, Leviticus chapter 11, verse 44 through 45. Ki ani Adonai Elohechem, for I am Hashem your God, and therefore you shall sanctify yourselves, and you will vihitem kedoshim ki kadosh ani, and therefore you will be holy, for I am holy. And you should also velo tetamu, not become tame, impure. You shall not contaminate et nafshotechem, your souls, through bechol hasheretz, to any teeming thing that creeps ha'aretz, upon the earth. So that would be an allusion to various forms of insects, whether that is land creatures or also sea creatures such as shrimp, which is the ocean's equivalent of what we would call an ukaracha, a cockroach. Ki ani Adonai hama'aleh etchem me'eretz Mitzrayim. The reason why God says you should actually adhere to these words is because I am Hashem, who elevates you from the land of Mitzrayim, lehot lechem, to be to you, le'elokim, a God to you, to be a power to you, v'hiten kedoshin ki kadoshani, and therefore you shall be holy, for I am holy. Now this is very interesting. What is the connection with non-kosher food and Mitzrayim? What is the actual connection between those two subjects? Better yet, why does the Torah drastically change subjects in this week's Torah portion? That immediately after the death of Nadab and Avihu, Aaron's two sons, who tragically died because they went in unauthorized with their own incense into the Yehezqel, the sanctuary, and because Hashem did not command them to do that, they lost their life. Why is it that the Torah changes subjects and automatically goes into the laws like kashrut? What's that have to do? What's one have to do with the other? Because once again, if you read through the Torah portion, you know that as soon as the inauguration ceremony begins, the revelation of God appears, the glory of God appears, I should say, somewhat relatable to what the Jews experienced at Mount Sinai. And so the people are celebrating, but then in the midst of that celebration, tragedy strikes. Aharon's sons, they do something they were not commanded, and tragically they die. And from there, the Torah just delineates. It goes into the topic of kashrut, or into the dietary laws. And even though it goes into the dietary laws, the Torah doesn't cover everything when it comes to kashrut, okay? The laws of kashrut, as we observe them today, they're derived from the laws of shechita, the whole sacrificial system, because essentially what was permitted to go on the altar is what is permitted to go onto your table. And so whatever the Torah did not associate the altar with, that is what was prohibited from being on your table, so to speak. And so within that regards, the written Torah barely scratches the surface of this topic, and so you have to study, obviously, the works of the Mishnah to get a deeper appreciation to understand the actual concept of kashrut. But nonetheless, when the Torah delineates the kashrut, it focuses, as we're going to learn today, upon a certain set of animals. Not all animals, but just a certain set. And then the Torah goes from there into Parashat Tazria, where in the first 8 verses, it talks about the laws of a yoledet. A yoledet is a mother, a woman who gives birth, right? And so the Torah differentiates in a situation between a woman giving birth to a male versus a female. It talks about the blood of purity versus the blood impurity, 33 days versus 66 days, things of that nature. And then from there, the Torah spends the remaining part of Parashat Tazriah talking about a disease that develops in the skin that's called sara'at. And in many Bible translations in English, normally people translate this word and they read it as leprosy, but that's not actually true. It's not leprosy. It's a different form of disease that's actually not physical in origin. It's spiritual, but it manifests within inside a person's flesh. That individual who contracts sara'at, they become what's called a mitzorah. If they're a female, a mitzorat. And so the Torah then dedicates a whole topic of the mitzorah in Parashat Mitzorah. And so we learn about the purification process, the slaughtering of the two birds. One is slaughtered, one is set free. And then eventually the Torah comes back to address the death of Nadav and Avihu in Parashat Achremot. And that when the Torah addresses that topic, Aharon is basically given a warning that he should not enter into the sanctuary basically on his own volition. He actually has to follow the protocol, the halakha that God brings down. Now, mind you, there's another topic within that for another day, God willing, at which Aharon was permitted to enter into the Kodesh HaKodeshim any time he wanted to, as long as he treated it as a Yom Kippur. In other words, Aharon was not limited to the 10th of Tishrei like his future descendants would be. He could enter in anytime he wants. And we learn about this, obviously, through a few anomalies in the in the sequences of the Torah that are not in chronological order. But from there, we start to learn about the whole Yom Kippur process, the whole process of the two goats, one for Hashem, one for Azazel. And so from there, then the Torah changes gears to speak about forbidden relationships. So I mention all this because when you see the Torah changes subjects, you're kind of like, well, what does one have to do with the other? Did the laws of kashrut, actually, what does it have to do with the inauguration ceremony of the Mishkan? What does it have to do with Nadav and Avihu? Okay, not only that, what in the world does eating kosher have to do with being elevated out of Mitzrayim? So what is the actual meaning of this topic here? So when we start to learn about the laws of kashrut in this week's Torah portion, we learn about the subject of the kosher and non-kosher soul. What does that mean? Well, when the Torah stipulates the laws of kashrut, it tells us that the siman, the sign of a kosher animal, is that it has to have what is called split hooves. Mafreset parsa. Okay? Not only must it have split hooves, but that it also must ma'alat gera. It must maligera. It must also chew its cud. And so even though the Torah gives us these two specific, what we would call simanim, or two signs, it still chooses to delineate to 4 non-kosher animals that have at least one kosher siman or kosher sign. The Torah mentions that there are 3 animals that malat gera, that will chew their cud, but they do not have split hooves. And that there is 1 animal that does not chew its cud, but it does have split hooves. So the 3 animals that do chew their cud, but they don't have split hooves, one is the gamel, which we call the camel. The second would be called the shafan, okay, known as the hyrex. And this is a Middle East version of the shafan there. Sometimes I've seen some people mistaking them as a variation of the rabbit species, that these are related to them in some way, shape, or form, like a giant gerbil hamster of some sorts. And then the third one is what we call the arnevet, okay? The arnevet, and so obviously this is what's called a hare. This is obviously a much more larger version of your domesticated bunny rabbits that you have as pets at home. And this is actually an individual arnevet that is more native to parts of Israel as well. Now, the one animal that does not chew its cud, but does have a split hoof, is none other than the chazir. It's none other than the pig. And this is actually a better depiction I wanted you guys to look at, because I know in the Western world, people tend to look at the pig in their regular pinkish, skin tone, the very innocent type of looking pig. However, this is the true nature of a chazir, is what we would call a boar, okay, a more wild pig. And this is a better description of what a chazir is. Even though it's still a pig, nonetheless, it's still prohibited from consuming it, things of that nature. So the question that I want to raise here is, why does the Torah have to delineate to tell us about these 4 non-kosher animals? I mean, why does the Torah give a verse to each of these animals? Why these animals specifically? Because there's also other animals out there that don't qualify as being kosher, and yet the Torah doesn't talk about them, but yet the Torah wants to focus only on these specific animals. And not only that, when you actually look at the verses describing these animals, which we're going to go through here in a moment, why didn't the Torah simply put the gamel, the shafan, and the arnevet in the same verse together and say that basically these 3 animals are non-kosher, they're in the same category of being non-kosher, and the reason why is that they don't maligera, they don't chew their cud, okay? Or they chew their cud, but they don't have split hooves. So all 3 of them have the very similar characteristic traits. Now I can understand dedicating an entire verse to the chazir because it's actually opposite of the gamel, the shafan, and arnevet. However, I can't understand why the Torah would give a verse to each of these animals, such as the camel, the shafan, and the arnevet. Okay, especially when they appear to be identical in their non-kosher activity, meaning they don't have split hooves, but they chew their cud. So why does the Torah do this? Why doesn't it mention a whole volume of other non-kosher animals? Well, upon closer investigation of these pasukim or verses, we discover a unique insight. What's interesting about the Torah mentioning these 4 animals is that the Torah uses certain tenses to describe them. For instance, when it comes to the camel, the Torah says here in Vayikra Leviticus chapter 11, verse 4, it says, Et hagama ki malegera, the camel, it brings up its cud, it chews its cud. However, hu ufarsa enenu, its hoof is not split. Okay? It's enenu mafris tamechu lachem. And because its hoof is not split, it's tame, it's impure for you. Now, the word here, mafris, is used in the present tense. Interesting. Let's go forward to the next verse when it describes the shafan, which is the hyrax. It says here, ve'et hashafan ki malegera, pretty much verbatim, like what it just mentioned with the camel. It chews up its cud. Okay. However, hu farsa lo yafris tamechu lachem. However, its hoof's not split, it's unclean for you. Now, the word yafris is used in the future tense here. Now, if we go up to verse 6, when it talks about the arnevet, or the hair, ve'et ha'arnevet ki ma'alat gera hi. Now, the hair, for it brings up its cud, it chews its cud. However, ufarsa lo hifrisa temea hi lachem. But its hoof is not split, and therefore it's unclean for you. And the word here, hifrisa, is used in the past tense. This is fascinating. Why does the Torah describe the gamel, the shafan, and the arnevet in different tense forms, present, future, and past? So what about the chazir? Well, if we go up to verse 7 in Leviticus 11, we read here, Ved ha-chazir ki mavris parsahu. The pig, on the other hand, its hoof is split, and its hoof is completely separated. Okay? However, the Torah says here, it does not, v'hu gera lo yigar. But literally, as you're going to see here, actually it's highlighted in there in yellow, but it's also in brackets, it doesn't just say, but it does not chew its cud, and therefore tamechu lachem, it's unclean for you. But what you see here is that the actual pig's hooves, when the Torah mentions it, it's highlighted in orange here, when it says ki mafrif parsa, okay? It's in the present tense. But then it changes to future tense form when it says v'hu gera lo yigar. Okay, literally, it will not chew its cud. It doesn't say it in the Hebrew, it does not chew its cud. It says literally in Hebrew, it will not chew its cud, future tense. Now, you have to keep in mind that the Torah has made it a point to delineate, even though it already said that animals that have split hooves and chew their cud are kosher. These are perfectly permissible for you to consume. The Torah made that point already. So considering this, why does the Torah make it appear that the pig was maybe acceptable at one time, but will not be acceptable in the future because lo yigar, because it will not chew its cud? So what happened to the anatomical structure of the pig that it loses its kosher quality over time? I'd like to take a look here at the words of the Lubavitch Rebbe Zechron Levracha. He brings down this very well-known statement in his Likutei Sichot dealing with Parashat Shemini. I want us to read it here. We'll come back to it later. And he says this regarding the topic of the chazir. He says, in the Messianic era, when the true divine nature of every creature will be openly revealed, the pig will stand vindicated as a kosher animal. Because with all its posing and prancing, the pig does one thing for us. It forces us to confront our own insidious evil nature, combat it, and ultimately rise above it. So the choice is ours. We can mask our deficiencies by verbally maligning the innocent pig, or we can recognize the pig for what it is, a mirror to our own animal selves. We must concentrate on perfecting and purifying our own animal souls, and God will reciprocate by koshering the pig. Interesting. The kosher pig. Quite a oxymoron, right? Well, we're going to come back to the Rebbe's quote because he's shedding some very valuable information that the Torah is trying to teach us here. Now, to make things more interesting, if we go over to Parashat Ra'eh in Chumash Devarim, where Moshe reiterates the laws of kashrut, we discover something different from what is being outlined here in Parashat Shemini. Over in Parashat Ra'eh, we discover that the Torah groups the shafan, the gamal, and the arnevet all in the same verse, but describes their actions all in the past tense, while describing the chazir chewing its cud in the present tense. We see here in Devarim, Deuteronomy chapter 14, verse 7 through 8. And therefore it says the camel, the arnevet, the cher, and also the shafan, the harix. It says ki ma'alegera, they chew their cud, they bring it up, okay, but their hooves is not split, their hoof is not split, and therefore they are timeim him lachem, they are impure for you. However, ve'echa chazir, regarding the pig on the other hand, it has a split hoof. However, it does not chew its cud, hu velo gera tamehu, and therefore it is impure or unclean for you. The Midrash explains that the reason why the gamal, shafan, and harnevet are read in the past, present, and future tense in this week's Torah portion is that these animals correspond to the different Gentile kingdoms that would oppress Israel in their different respective exiles. So we see here in Vayikra Rabbah 13:5, it mentions over here that regarding the gamal, the camel, it represents Bavel or Babylon, to whom it is said over in Psalm chapter 137 verse 8, where it says, O daughter of Bavel, you are to be destroyed. However, Ashrei, happy is he that repays your retributions, or your gimulech, and the root there is gimul, I left in brackets, as you have gamal dealt with us. As you have dealt with us. Interesting. So what's happening over here in this passage according to the Midrash? Well, first contextually, over in this passage here, in Psalms, David HaMelech, he is seen praising Darius for treating Babylon harshly, because Babylon treated the Jews harshly when they were exiled to Babylon. Okay, so this is what's actually over here, that Babylon is being basically treated meter keneged meter, measure for measure. Now mind you, we know David already passed away, and even though his name is attributed to Sefer Tehillim, we know he didn't write all the Mizmorim or the songs that are within it. So just excuse me there for saying that David specifically wrote the psalm. It's attributed to David, obviously, and others as well, like Moshe Rabbeinu and Asaph, etc. But the point here contextually is that the passage is praising Darius for basically treating Babylon harshly because Babylon treated Israel harshly. Now, over there in Psalms, there's a unique play on the word here, gimluech, right? Which is related to gamal. And therefore, what we see here is that it's a play on words. And what this is doing is teaching us that just as a camel will come and consume anything, its nature to consume thorns, a stack of grain, a standing corn, likewise did Nebuchadnezzar come to anyone in his path, whether they were righteous or wicked, to consume them, to destroy them. And so basically, just as Bavel consumed the Jewish people, likewise Bavel would then be destroyed and consumed by Darius. That what would happen later on in the future. Going on from there, the Midrash goes on to say, regarding the shafan, well, this alludes to Madai. And therefore, the rabbis and Rav Yehuda ben Rav Simon taught that just as the shafan exhibits both signs of impurity and signs of purity, so this is alluding to it not having split hooves, but it does male gera, it does chew its cud, which is a kosher semen. Likewise, the empire of Madai produced both righteous leaders and wicked leaders. Rav Yehuda ben Rav Simon said, the last Darius was Esther's son. He was pure from his mother's side and impure from his father's side. So obviously the Midrash is alluding to the story of Purim, Mordecai, Esther, Achashverosh, etc. Going on from there, the Midrash says, the Arnevet, well, that is a remez to Yavan, to Greece. And it also happened to be the name either of the mother or wife of Talmai, okay? And therefore, which is the Greek equivalent of the Hebrew word Arnevet. And so basically, even if I'm not mistaken, in the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Torah, instead of actually translating it, the Arnevet, in a more literal way to its equivalent in Greek, the translators of the Septuagint, they avoided that to avoid any scrutiny, because then they would think that the Torah is making fun of Talmai's mother/wife, or whoever had that name. Going on from there, the Midrash jumps forward and it says also Chazir, regarding the Chazir, Zo Edom, this refers to Edom. Why is Edom compared to a Chazir, the Midrash asks? This is to tell you that just as a Chazir, or reclining, puts forth its hooves as if to say, see, I am clean, so too does the empire of Edom boast as it commits violence and robbery under the guise of establishing a judicial tribunal. And this may be compared to a governor who put to death thieves, adulterers, sorcerers, etc., or murderers. He leaned over to a counselor and he said, I myself did these three things in one night. Very, very, normal behavior of Edom, acting as a conservative front, religious front, but yet guilty of very, very insidious crimes in private, okay? And we see that here as well in the United States today, that our government officials do treasonous actions, and yet they're not locked up. But if you go to a protest, you can be thrown in jail and be badly mistreated. That's Edom for you. Now, considering that the Midrash's explanation that each non-kosher animal corresponds to a different Gentile kingdom that ruled over the Jews, we learn why the Torah writes the Gamel, the Shafan, Harnevet, in past, present, and future tense forms. These tense forms are describing the spiritual nature of the Jewish people during these different exiles, or these different eras of exile. In other words, the Midrash is not so much concerned about describing the nature of the Gentile nations who oppress Israel, okay, which were symbolic of these unkosher animals, but the external quality of those Gentile kingdoms that ruled over the Jewish people were really symbolic of the non-kosher quality that existed within the Jewish people. That's very important, because they are a mirror reflection of the sins of the Jewish people that basically got them into exile in the first place. That's a very important point to bring out. So when we go back here and take a look at verse 4, let's say regarding the camel, And we see that it describes here mafris, its hooves being put in the present tense. This reflects the Jewish people's current spiritual quality. Now, over in Parashat Bechukotai, the Torah foretells what was going to happen to the Jewish people if they violated the laws of Shemitah. The violation would lead to a punishment of exile. And so what exactly was mentioned in Parashat Bechukotai came to pass in the days of Yirmiyahu HaNavi, or Jeremiah, in which the kingdom of Bavel came down. It destroyed Jerusalem, it destroyed the first Beit HaMikdash, and eventually exiled the Jewish people into Babylon. And therefore the Jews were sentenced there for 70 years. So in other words, for each year they violated Shemitah, Hashem added on an additional year of galut, or exile. And so from there we go from Jeremiah to Daniel, Daniel trying to interpret the book of Jeremiah, figuring out when the 7 years of galut will be up. The Malach tells them, oh, the ready's up, but your people did not do a Shuvah Shlema. And this is why we read about Ezra, Nehemiah, the Anshe Knesset Hagadol, as they returned back from the exile, that many Jews remained in exile. And so eventually, Daniel has shown that the galut is going to Gilgal, is going to continue to roll along, okay? And eventually you'll end up in the era of Rome, or Edom. When we go over here to verse 5, when it speaks about the shafan, we read the word yafris, which is in the future tense. And this refers, as the Midrash mentions, to the kingdom of Madai. And so the exile of Madai was a continuation of Bavel. And once again, referring back to Sefer Daniel, specifically in Daniel chapter 9, verse 23 to 27, Hashem showed Daniel that even though the exile of Bavel was nearing its end, spiritually the Jews were still in exile. And that exile would continue all the way to Edom. It does not have an expiration date on it. As the Ramban tells us, it's up to the Jewish people to perform the prerequisite of Shuvah that needs to be done in order for the galut to come to an end. Now, the Tanakh tells us that at that time, once again, that Cyrus made a decree for the Jews to go back to Eretz Israel. They can restart the temple, try to rebuild their communities, but it never happened, right? Only a small fragment came back under the leadership of Ezra, Nehemiah, etc. Now, we go over here to verse 6 when it talks about the Arnevet. And there we read the word Hifrisa is in the past tense. And this refers, as the Midrash tells us, to Yavan, to Greece. Now you might be thinking, well, if Greece is future tense, then why is this in the past tense, right? Well, after Hellenism invaded Israel, thanks to many Jews who became Hellenists, right? It wasn't like the Greeks forced Hellenism down the throats of the Jews, even though it did get very violent, okay, as far as like Greece, Antiochus despising Judaism. But that whole issue began by Jews assimilating amongst Greek society. And so after Hellenism invaded Israel after the year 330 BCE, Sefer Hashmonaim, or what we call the Book of Maccabees, as well as Josephus, tells us that many Jews became Hellenists by denying the Torah and embracing Greek culture. And so the past tense form here of Hifrisa reflects the Jewish people becoming spiritually retroactive. In other words, instead of emerging out of the exile of Bavel and Madai spiritually refined, many Jews wanted to become like their Gentile neighbors. And so history tells us that even though the Hashmonaim eventually conquered the Greeks, tragically there was an internal war amongst the Hashmonaim family. And eventually this eternal war is what led to a peace treaty with Rome. And therefore Israel became subjugated to the authority of Rome. So considering this, we now understand why over in Parashat Re'eh, the Torah puts the Gamo, the Shafan, and the Arnevet in the same pasuk or verse compared to what we read in Parashat Shemini, where they are listed separately. When the Torah speaks about the Shafan, Gamo, and Arnevet over in Parashat Re'eh, it mentions these animals all in the past tense. Why, you might ask? It's because those kingdoms would cease to exist by the time the Jewish people experience the Galut of Rome. Now I mention this because when describing the Gamal, the Shafan, and Arnevet, according to the laws of kashrut, the Torah says that these animals have one kosher siman and one non-kosher siman. The fact that they don't have split hooves means that they are not kosher. But the fact that they chew their cud means that they are kosher. And so what this teaches us is that even though the Jewish people went into exile under the Gentile kingdoms of Bavel, Madai, and Yavan, who were once again an external reflection of the Jewish people's defective personalities, the reason why the Jews survived those exiles is because spiritually there was a kosher siman within them, Malay Gera. What does that mean? I'll get to that towards the end. Now, when speaking about kashrut in general, most people in North America, okay, they tend to spiritually dumb down the importance of eating kosher. Now, unless you are brought up from and you live in an observant community, this wouldn't be applicable. But the more you assimilate into a secular society and be questioning the validity of the mitzvot in 21st century, modern progressive times, many people don't think it's relative or it's relevant to have to eat kosher. Now, this view is basically based on the attitude that kashrut was basically limited to the ritual laws of the sacrificial system. And therefore, it's not really relevant to keep kosher because, for one, you're not a Kohen, you don't have a Mizbeach, right? And so, sadly, this attitude of Judaism, which is really from the Haskalah movement, is really reflective of what was picked up from Christianity, who attempted to say that the sacrificial laws have been done away with by the sacrifice of Jesus, which is completely bogus, okay? Completely bogus. And that's another topic for another day. But it's bogus, okay? But this is the attitude that the Haskalah movement picked up. Now, I would like to challenge this view, okay, in relation to the topic here today. Man was created as a soul and a body. So we're somewhat of a hybrid. And so the food and drink we consume is both physical and spiritual. When we eat and drink, our body benefits from the physical elements of the food or drink we consume. But our soul is strengthened by its spiritual element. So you might be thinking, how can food have a spiritual element? Hang on. The Torah tells us that man does not live on bread alone, but on what comes out of the mouth of Hashem. Deuteronomy 8:3. Lo el halechem levado yichyeh ha'adam. Man does not live on bread alone. Ki el kol motza pi Adonai yichyeh ha'adam. But on what comes from out of the mouth of Hashem. That's what man lives on. Here the Torah is trying to teach us that it's not only the visible part of food, okay, that contains sustenance for man, the nutrition, etc. Rather, food also contains motzah pi Adonai. There's an invisible expression of God's Spirit which also contributes to keeping our soul alive. So when the Torah defines the laws of kashrut, it does not say simply we are to eat a certain type of animal, okay? Rather, the Torah says that we are to eat from a living source. What do I mean? Look here in Leviticus 11, verse 2 to 3. Zo hachaya. Okay, translations will say these are the animals. But the Hebrew doesn't say that. Zo hachaya. This, the living asher tochelu mikol habehema, is that which you may consume habehema from the animals asher el ha'aretz that are upon the earth. Literally, it says here, the living. And it goes on to say everything among the animals that have split hooves, which are completely separated, and that which also ma'alat gera, that is what you actually may tochelu, you may consume, you may eat. I want you to focus here when the Torah says Zoha Chaya. It's from among the living you may eat. Now what does that mean? It then goes on to say Micho HaBehema, from all the animals of Behema Asher Ha'aretz upon the earth. Huh? All the living animals are upon the earth? What the heck does that mean? Does a chazir not live? It's on the earth. Right? A cow moo, it's roaming the fields, right? Mooing around. I mean, that eats, a pig lives, right? I mean, even though a pig is an omnivore, right? I mean, it's still roaming the earth. So what does that mean? And obviously we know the Torah differentiates between a chazir and an actual para afterwards, because the split hooves completely separated, and maligira has to chew its cud. So obviously the pig is missing one of those. Shemini. But the point is, does a pig not live? I mean, if you were to approach the language of the Torah, zohachaya, I mean, a pig lives, yes? No? I mean, it's not like it's artificial intelligence, at least not now. Bill Gates is not trying to get me to eat an artificial piggy, even though you do have fake, what do they have? Fake shellfish and stuff that people could consume. I don't understand why they do that. I don't know. Anyway, let me focus back on the topic at hand. So, one of the reasons why the Torah addresses the topic of kashrut after the death of Nadav and Avihu is because Hashem wanted to establish a conceptual link between food consumed by man and food consumed by the altar. I'd like to delineate here to a very interesting quote from the Shla HaKadosh, Rabbi Yeshayahu Horowitz. And his commentary to Parashat Shemini, he brings us down. He says that the spirit of impurity rests upon forbidden foods, and anyone who eats them ingests the spirit of impurity into his or her own soul. Consumption of pure foods confers upon the person eating them a spirit of purity and holiness resting on these foods. This is why Shlomo wrote, quoting here from Proverbs chapter 13, verse 25, Sadiq ochel lisovad nafsho, that the righteous man eats to satisfy his soul. Interesting. So considering what the Shalah is saying, we need to keep in mind that the Torah defines kosher animals, once again, by this expression, Zo hachaya asher tochelu. Sure, a pig may be physically alive. It's walking on the earth just like a cow. Or shellfish or shrimp may be physically alive as it scavenges through the bottom of the ocean floor. But spiritually, that nephesh that's within it, that behemah, okay, that soul of that animal is associated with what we would call the sitra ara, the other side, the dark side. And therefore, when we absorb them into our being, we are fusing the soul of impurity into our soul. I'm sure you have heard the expression, you are what you eat. When a person eats a non-kosher animal, they are not simply eating a non-kosher animal. Rather, they are also ingesting the spirit of impurity associated with that animal. So spiritually speaking, kosher animals aid in one's ability to tune into the proper frequency of God's Spirit. When we ingest non-kosher animals, that frequency becomes obstructed. It becomes distorted. It's almost like when you're in the city and you're tuned onto the FM dial and you have your favorite radio station on. But the more you travel outside the city, you start to hear sizzling and distortion on the channel. Why is that? Or sometimes you hear another channel from a nearby town trying to bleed over to that dial because you're no longer in range. You're out of the frequency. This is the same thing when it comes to eating non-kosher animals. It distorts the frequency, lowers the vibrational frequency. This is why people say they feel like they have a fogginess. This is not just from eating heavy meat. That's true as well on a physical level, but there's also a spiritual component to this. And so the Torah calls kosher animals chaya, literally living. Why? Because they aid in a person's soul who is serving HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And so this would include having the ability to have a spirit of discernment, a spirit of chachma, binah, da'at, knowledge, wisdom, understanding, sechel, comprehension. These are vital spiritual assets we need when it comes to understanding the Torah. And so this is why at the end of the Torah portion of Shemini, God explains that one of the functions of ingesting kosher food is to learn to discern between the impervious forces of pure and impure. Leviticus 11:47 says, Lehavdil ben hatamei uven hatahor, to distinguish between the impure and also the pure. Now, over in Sefer Yehezqel, God mentions that the function of the Kohanim, the teachers of the Torah, is to be able to teach the people how to discern between the pure and impure and between the holy and the profane. Ezekiel chapter 44, verse 23. Ve'et ami yoru ben kodesh lecho, and they shall teach my people the difference between holy and lecho, mundane or profane, uvein tameh letahor yodeum, and to cause them to know. I want you to pay attention to that. Yodeum, to know between the impure and pure. This is one of my favorite phrases that always appear to the Torah. We don't have a commandment to believe in Hashem. We have a commandment to know Hashem. And therefore, the purpose of this consuming pure living source is in order to better know our Father in heaven. Ve'adata tahayim, you should know this day. We say it in the Elenu prayer, right? Which we borrow from Deuteronomy. Know, you should know, you should know. Everything is to know Hashem. And so, when a person consumes a non-kosher animal, they lose the spiritual ability to decipher between holy and profane, or pure and impure. And this, yes, also trickles down to where we read in Parashat Shoftim. The Torah orders us, commands us to listen to those judges who sit in the seat of Moshe Rabbeinu. And then the Torah, juxtaposed to that, it prohibits planting an Ashreya tree next to the Mizbeach of Hashem. In other words, the Ashreya tree was an Istar tree, a tree of worship of Avodah Zarah, idolatry of Istar. And so one was not to mamash, literally put it next to the altar, but also figuratively speaking, that's an allegory that one should not stick an incompetent rabbi, okay, who mixes Torah with Avodah Zarah next to the altar, their incompetent teacher, because then they would teach pure is impure and impure is pure. And this individual then dilutes the minds of Am Israel, because now they're basically ruling on Torah concepts in a very impaired manner. And therefore, that's not going to have a good ending. And this is tragically what happened to Israel's history as we read why exile began, because the leaders, they cannot discern the time that they were in. So what about the chazir, the piggy? Let's consider the name of the pig in Hebrew. Hebrew is such a very descriptive language. Well, the name chazir in Hebrew means much more than pig. In fact, the word chazir comes from the word chazar, which means to return. And the Midrash says that the pig is called the pig. Okay, it's because it's going to return. It's going to become kosher at the advent of the Messianic era, as we see here in Vayikra Rabbah 13:5. V'lama nichras shema chazir. Why is the pig called a pig or a chazir? Shema chazeret atara livaleha. Because it's going to return chazar, the crown, to its owner. This indicated by what it is written in Obadiah, who was a former Edomite, a descendant of Esau who became a Jew, in chapter 1, verse 21, where it says, Va'alu Moshe'im Bahar Sinai, and saviors will ascend Mount Sinai to do what? Lishpot et Har Esav, to judge the Mount of Esau. And then when that happens, V'hayatala Adonai HaMelucha, then the kingdom will be Hashem's. So since the chazir represents Rome, Edom, etc., and Rome was responsible for the destruction of the Beit Sheni, the second temple, the Midrash sees that in the future, Rome, which also represents Christianity, but not just the religion of Christianity, it's a system, okay, that would represent the majority of the world. That system of Edom is going to return the crown back to the Jewish people. It's going to return that which it stole and bring back to its rightful owners. When this day happens, then the kingdom will be completely Hashem's, as the verses in Obadiah. Now, I'd like to suggest an insight here, a chidush, that the Midrash here is focusing much more on just the entity that we recognize of Edom or Christianity. If the previous Gentile kingdoms before Rome were a reflection of the Jewish people spiritually, then what about Rome, who we call Edom? In every Yaakov, there is an Esav, and in every Esav, there is a Yaakov. Now earlier, when quoting from the Shalah, he alluded to the verse over there in Proverbs chapter 13, 25, that said when a righteous person eats, He eats to ochel lish sova nafsho, to satisfy his soul. Do you know what the end of that verse says? The end of the verse goes on to say, Uveten rashaim tachsar, but the stomach of the wicked is empty. What does that mean? When Esav gave away his bechor, his right to be the firstborn, he gave it away over what? Over a bowl of lentil soup. We go back to Parashat Toledot, Genesis 25, 29 through 30. It says over here, Yaakov simmered the stew, and this was supposed to be the levaya of Avraham Avinu, okay? When this is happening. So technically, Esav should be there sitting shiva with the family. But nonetheless, you see, Vayavo Esav min hasadeh, Esav comes in from the field, and it says, Hu yaif, and he's very exhausted. Vayome Esav el Yaakov, and he says to his brother, listen, pour into me. He says, into me, ha'itenina min ha'adom. Some of that red stuff. Why? Because listen, ki yaif, I'm exhausted. And apparently he just did a murder in the field in which he killed Nimrod. Whether that's a positive or negative, that's for another topic for another day. But nonetheless, he committed the act of being a rotzach. Therefore, it says, called his name Edom. Al king kara shemo Edom. Why? Because it's associated with that red stuff. Almost sounds like a crack addict. Give me some of that good stuff, like Pookie in New Jack City. Give me some of that red stuff. Sorry for you guys who don't know that quotation, but just brings back a memory of a movie I saw when I was younger. Now, the expression that we just read there in Proverbs 13:25, Uvete rashaim tachsar, the stomach of the wicked is always empty. That means that Esav was not content with his lot in life. He was not content with being the Bechor. He was not content with the mission of Tikkun that was passed down from his grandfather Avraham. He was not content. And so he wanted to exchange it. He wanted to throw off the yoke of heaven. Over at Masechet Yoma, Chazal explained the difference between the sins of the Jewish people during the Beit Rishon and the Jews of the Beit Sheni. They say that the comparison can be compared to a fingernail and the stomach. What does that actually mean? Well, let's take a look here at Masechet Yoma 9b. It says over there that the fingernail of the first generation of the first temple was better than the stomach of the latter generation. Okay, what are we learning here about fingernails and stomachs? What does this have to do with the sin of the Jews of the first and second temple? On an anatomical level, a fingernail can be cut and can grow over and over again. A stomach, on the other hand, contains all the vital parts of the body. Has your esophagus, your small intestine, your spleen, gastric artery, blood supply, etc. A fingernail is external. It's exposed. While the stomach is something, it's eternal. It's concealed. What does this mean? Well, in the Parashat, the fingernail is transparent, just like the sins of the Jews of the first temple. While the second temple, which is compared to a stomach, is hidden. The sins of the second temple Jews were concealed. And this is why we read in Masechet Yoma 9b, it goes on and say afterwards, Aval mikdash sheni, shechu osechin b'Torah uv'mitzvot gimlu chasadim. The second temple, the Jews of that temple, why was it destroyed? Seeing that they were occupied with Torah, right? They also did gimlu chasadim. They were doing kind acts, right? They were clearly, observant Jews. So why was it destroyed? Because of one thing. Sinach chinam, because of baseless hatred. Everyone practiced Judaism, practiced mitzvot and Torah, but they lacked love and respect for each other. And so you could say that the Jews of the Bayit Sheni, they stuck their hooves out, showing their kosher Shemini. And you can say that pretty much they were saying, Terei, anachnu Yehudim Sedukim. Anachnu, you see, we're righteous, kosher Jews. We learned about the tragic story of Rabbi Akiva losing 24,000 disciples over the 33-day period of Sfirat HaOmer because they did not have respect for one another. We learned about a lot of other tragedies that were also happening. The corrupt oligarchy of the Sadducees, the Essenes and the Zealot movement, so many different things that were happening at that time. So even though these individuals proclaimed to be kosher, on the inside they did not mali geira, they did not chew their cud. Outside they clearly look kosher. So when the Torah speaks about the various simanim that makes an animal kosher or not kosher, what are we supposed to learn from that? Does having split hooves and chewing its cud qualify an animal as kosher? Let us remember that the Torah has chosen to delineate, to tell us what is kosher and what is not kosher, even though it already told us what qualifies as kosher. And so this would indicate that just because an animal has split hooves and chews its cud does not mean that it's entirely kosher. The Torah's description of having split hooves and male gerah is only called a siman, a sign that it's kosher. A siman means that something is symptomatic. You run a fever, you have a temperature. Is the temperature the underlying cause of your sickness, or is it a symptom of your sickness? It's clearly a symptom. When the Torah delineates to tell us about the gamol, shafan, arnevet, and also the chazir, it's telling us that these four animals have a siman. They have a symptomatic quality to themselves. One is kosher, one is not kosher. So for the shafon, gamol, arnevet, their kosher quality is that they male gerah, they chew their cud. And for the chazir, its kosher quality was that it had split hooves. Now the chazir is faulted with being a bootleg kosher animal because it does not chew its cud. And so on the outside it appears kosher, but on the inside it's not kosher. The chazir represents the Jews of the Second Temple because their emunah and HaKadosh Baruch Hu was hypocritical when compared to their ancestors of the First Temple. It was hypocritical in the sense that they presented themselves as being kosher externally, but eternally they were filled with treif. Now it's very interesting that the word gerah in Hebrew is related to the word garon, which means throat. Fascinating. Our throat is connected to our stomach via the esophagus. The pig is deemed non-kosher because it does not male gerah. And so until the pig can male gerah, it's not redeemable. And therefore, it's not kosher. Consider again the words of Shlomo HaMelech when he told us in Proverbs 13:25, Sadiq yochel lisova nafsho. The righteous man eats to satisfy his soul. Satisfy his soul. The Torah once again defines a kosher animal, a kosher cow, as zot hachaya asher tochelu, as a source that we can consume. It's a living source that the righteous can eat. So what is it about this nice, friendly, kosher-looking cow here who appears to be very happy that not only does this kosher cow benefit our physical well-being, but it also could strengthen our soul? And how is that different from the pig, who may give a person physical strength, right? But it weakens their soul with tumah. Let's imagine for a second. Entertain yourself. Go to a quiet place. Turn the lights down and go to your favorite room in the house or your office. And close your eyes and imagine that you are a cow. Can you see yourself frolicking the green hills of your country or your neighborhood, rummaging through the grass? Now imagine you're a cow and you want to go to a restaurant. What would you eat? Well, cows eat one thing. Obviously, they eat grass. So when a cow eats breakfast, he ingests the grass, which sits in his stomach until lunchtime. At lunchtime, the cow then ruminates the grass that he ate for breakfast and he chews it over. When the cow is done with his lunch, he waits till dinner, where he once again ruminates his breakfast that he also had for lunch, but now it's also becoming his dinner. And so the cow is happy. The cow is content with the meal that he ate earlier in the day. But imagine if you were a chazir, you were a pig. And as a pig, you wanted to go to a restaurant. What would you eat? Which restaurant? Pigs are omnivores, which means that they consume both plants and animals. They eat anything. And so unlike cows, pigs are nutniks when it comes to their food source. And in fact, pigs remind me of human beings that love to go to the buffet line. You know, if you've ever seen a buffet before, folks will go in there, they'll fill their plate up with all various specimen of meat, and he add a little salad to the side just to justify that they're not pigging out on food, pun intended. According to the Torah, a person's dietary habit reflects their spiritual conduct, regardless if they eat kosher or non-kosher. The human being at the buffet is the epitome of the pig. As human beings, we are never satisfied with our lot in life. We are like spiritual omnivores. We want to taste everything in life. We try to hide our selfish impulses by showing everyone our split hooves. We try to prove, hey, we're kosher. This is kosher. You can't get any more kosher. I'm glad kosher. And so on the outside, we profess how much we love Hashem, how much faith we have. So on the outside, we give a very good impression that we're kosher. But on the inside, that's a different story. On the inside dwells a selfish beast that's depressed, that's angry, that's bitter, that's confused, that's ungrateful. As spiritual pigs, we want to treat life like it's a buffet line where we get to pick out what we want to indulge in, not knowing that our indulgence is really a reflection of Esau, who is willing to give away his birthright over his fleshly desires. And because we don't get what we want from the buffet line of life, we then go rogue like a pig. You know what happens when a pig goes rogue? I showed you the image earlier. It becomes a boar. That cute little innocent pig that people like to look at on the farms, right, becomes a real behemoth, a real beast of an animal. It devours and destroys. It reaps havoc wherever it goes. And so what makes the pig not kosher is that it does not male gera. It does not chew its cud. The kosher cow does chew its cud. Do you understand what the Torah is trying to say when it says male gera? Take a look at this cow. Do you see yourself in this cow? In fact, I want this cow's image to be embedded into your brain the next time you sit down and eat a piece of hamburger. Just want you to think about this cow. Now let's think about this. This animal is kosher by its hooves, but also because it's male gera. The pig has the hooves, but it does not have male gera. What does that mean exactly? The word male in Hebrew is from the root word Allah, which means to ascend, like aliyah. The word gera, which I mentioned before, that is related to the word garon, which is throat. The throat is connected to the stomach via the esophagus. And so a cow, ma'aleh, it causes its food to ascend over and over and over. And so through the act of gera, which means to basically like to ruminate, is also related to the word gara, which means to drag. So when a cow, male gera, when it chews its cud, when it ruminates its food by gera, by dragging it through its garon, through its throat, it's causing it to come up again. So when Shlomo HaMelech comes along and says, Sadiq yochel lish sova nasho, the righteous eats to satisfy his soul, he's saying that the righteous resemble the kosher cow. This is who they resemble. They resemble this guy right here. They resemble the kosher parah. Because the cow is content with his little square block of grass, his little square patch of grass. He goes to it in the morning, in the afternoon, and at night. And every time he's bringing it up, he's grateful for the same blade of grass that he had in the morning as he is at night. And so what does that mean? That means for the righteous, who's satisfied to eat their soul, the righteous is content with his or her lot in life. The righteous is not concerned about the buffet line in life where they can pick out what they like and avoid what they don't like. And therefore, when the righteous undergoes hardships in life, what does the righteous do? The righteous ruminates on the goodness of Hashem. And even though the righteous may not feel like worshiping Hashem, the righteous gra drags his voice up to his garon to offer shevach, praise to all the kindness that Hashem has bestowed upon them. And so the praise and thanks that the righteous give God is causing them to make an aliyah. There's a spiritual elevation here. They are ascending in order to hachaya, to experience life, to be living. And this is why the Torah permits a kosher cow to be used as an olah, an elevation offering. And this is also why, once again, next time when you sit down and you're about to say the blessing over your fine hamburger, I want you to understand that you are doing somewhat of a tikkun of some sorts, that cow that you're about to ingest, previously when it was alive, was grazing on the field, under the open skies, smiling, grateful for the little bit of grass that it consumes and ruminates. And now that cow has finally fulfilled its purpose by elevating the someach, the vegetation life of the earth, and it went into its system to help it develop and to grow. Now that the plant life that went into the cow is now going into you, which means that when you sit there and you're basically chewing, you should chew with gratitude before Hashem. That you should be eternalizing the actual personality of the cow within your life. Gratitude, being thankful. The reason why the pig does not mali gerah is because when the pig cannot pig out on the buffet line of life, it holds back giving praise to God. It's not content. But in order to fool people, the pig shows his hooves by saying, oh, look, I'm kosher. I'm a kosher person, I'm a kosher gal, I'm a kosher guy, whatever. As I explained earlier, the Torah in this week's Torah portion says, V'hu gerah lo yigar, that the pig will not chew its cud, future tense, which would indicate that all hope for the pig may be lost. However, reading from the quotes from Chazal, the sages appear to be optimistic about the redeemable kosher quality of the pig, that split hoof. And the sages explain that the reason why the pig, once again, is called a chazir is because it's going to eventually chazar. It's going to return back. Now, I'd like for us to revisit the words of the Lubavitch Rebbe that I quoted from earlier in his Likutei Sichot from Parashat Shemini. And let us focus now and see, in relation to what I've said, the Rebbe's words from a new light, a new perspective. He said, in the Messianic era, when the true divine nature of every creature will be openly revealed, the pig will stand vindicated as a kosher animal. Because with all its posing and prancing, the pig does one thing for us. It forces us to confront our own insidious, evil nature, combat it, and ultimately rise above it. In other words, what the Rebbe is saying, when you're looking at the pig, you're really looking at yourself. That's what it is. You go around prancing, dancing, frolicking, oh, I'm kosher, this and that, but you're really a hypocrite. But, Baruch Hashem, the pig is there as a siman, a sign of a symptom that you have, and therefore you can combat it. You can rise above it. So the choice is ours, he says. We can mask our deficiencies by verbally maligning the innocent pig. The pork, the chazer, treif, right? Or we can recognize the pig for what it is. A mirror to our own animal selves. Our own nefesh behemah. Our own pig-like nature, that we are spiritual omnivores, is what the Rebbe is saying. We must concentrate on perfecting and purifying our own animal souls. And God will reciprocate by, yes, koshering the pig. So for all those shirim that you may have heard out there by some rabbis entertaining, that one day I may be able to eat kosher or pig flesh. Keep dreaming, all right? Don't touch the other white meat, guys. That pig is not the pig that was going to be kosher. You and I are the pig that is supposed to become kosher. That's the pig. And therefore, about the Edom returning is really about the Am Israel coming from out of Edom, being koshered all the way through. And seen as kosher, from the word kosher, means fit. It's something that's fit in the eyes of Hashem. God reciprocates and He koshers us. Now, I mentioned previously that the end of Parashat Shemini, okay, juxtapose not eating unkosher food with Yetziat Mitzrayim. And I asked, what does eating non-kosher food have to do with the exodus of Egypt? Let us go back here to Leviticus 11, 44 through 45. God says, I am Hashem your God, you should sanctify yourselves, you will be holy, I am holy, you should not contaminate your souls through any teeming thing that creeps on the earth. Why is that? Ki ani Adonai, hama'aleh etchem me'eretz Mitzrayim. For I am Hashem your God, who elevates you from the land of Mitzrayim. Li'hol lachem le'elokim, to be a God to you. And therefore, v'hiten kedushin ki kadoshani, you should be holy, you should be sanctified, you should be separate, just as I am, God says. We see here highlighted in yellow the phrase, hama'aleh etchem me'eretz Mitzrayim. I who elevates you from the land of Mitzrayim. I want to point out that this phrase here is in the present tense. So what does this have to do with the consumption of what the Torah calls here sharatzim? Sharatzim, teamy things, ukarachas, cockroaches, shrimp, whatever. What's that have to do with Mitzrayim? What's one have to do with the other? I'd like to go back here to Parashat Shemot. At the very beginning, the Torah describes the Jewish people in a unkosher way. What do I mean? Exodus 1:7 says, Uvnei Israel paru vayish retzu vayirbu. The children of Israel were fruitful, teemed, increased, and became strong. Very, very much so, and the land became filled, otam, with them. I want you to notice that here the Torah compares the Jewish people to sharatzim in Mitzrayim. The prohibition of consuming sharatzim has to do with the prohibition of consuming the desires of the ego. Yes, in Parashat Shemot, it describes the Jews multiplying. I don't know if you guys have ever ran across an infestation of bugs, okay, whether you had them in your house or you've seen them, but it wouldn't be a pleasant experience if you had an infestation of roaches, right? Obviously, the way they multiply and everything. But the Torah is not in a positive light describing the Jews' procreation here. It describes them with an unkosher character trait. And the Midrash on that Parashat tells us that instead of influencing Mitzrayim, Mitzrayim was influencing the Jews. That the Jews were everywhere and anywhere at that time. They were at the theaters, the supermarket, they were at the stock exchange. Like cockroaches are everywhere. This is what was happening because they were becoming influenced by the Tumah of Mitzrayim. This is why only 1/5 of the Jewish people made it out. 4/5 perished because they choose to stay behind in that environment of Tumah. And so what we have to understand is that when the Torah prohibits us from consuming sharatzim, this is about prohibiting us from consuming the desires of the ego, which is associated with the lowliness of the earth. When a person becomes full of physical desires, they render their soul impure, just like a pig. Ingesting a little non-kosher food here and there may not damage your soul, but continuous consumption of the impure is what leads to complete defilement of the soul. And so the consumption of impure sources, food sources, sharatzim or chazir flesh, it dulls our spiritual senses, which makes them desensitized to the forces of tumah. And by consuming these impure sources, a person prevents himself from spiritual elevation. This is the reason why Leviticus 11:45 is in the present tense when God says, Hama'aleh echem me'eretz Mitzrayim, that I am Hashem your God, who elevates you from out of Mitzrayim. And in fact, if you went back here, I don't have the verse on the screen, but if you go back to Exodus 1:1, when it describes the descendants of Yaakov descending, it's in the present tense. Why the present tense? Because every day we wake up, we are always descending into a meitzar. That's the root of Mitzrayim. It's a restriction, a sar, a trouble. But every day, we also are required to elevate ourselves from out of Mitzrayim. Mitzrayim. That's why we read in the third part of the Shema, when we read for the tzitzit, God says, I've elevated you from the land. Every day, a person has to see themselves coming from out of Mitzrayim. But there's a volunteer choice. We either choose or not choose. And friend, I can tell you right now, we cannot ascend from out of Mitzrayim if our hearts are obstructed with impurity. So what about Nadav and Avihu's connection to all this and unkosher food? Easy. Once you understand the notion of what the unkosher food represents, the impurities, what it's symbolic of, the Torah is giving you a psychological insight in what was going wrong with Nadav and Avihu. These boys are supposed to be tzaddikim, the Kohanim, they're Aharon's two older sons. Just to walk into the Yehezqel, unauthorized, and do what they did, one would have to say you have to be out your mind, and that's exactly what happened. They were spiritually impaired. A ruach shtut entered into them. Now, I don't have the time to talk about it here today because there's 5 different interpretations brought down by Chazal why Nadav and Avihu faced the demise that they did, such as they were not married, didn't have kids. They tried to render a halakhic decision behind Moshe and Aharon's back. They were waiting for Moshe and Aharon to die. There's variations of that, and they all actually they all agree, essentially, even though there's different interpretations, they're saying the same thing. But the point is, when the Torah delineates to talk about kashrut, tazriya, yoledet, sara'at, metzora, and it goes into all this topic before coming back to address the sons of Aaron's death in Parashat Achrei Mot, the Torah is trying to delineate into a psychological overview to explain what happened with Aharon's sons. So sara'at is a skin mutation of someone who's guilty of motzi ra. A metzora is a compound from the words motzi, to bring out, ra, evil. Specifically, motzi shem ra, to bring evil out. Speak l'shon hara. If Nadav and Avihu attempted to speak behind Aharon and Moshe's back, motzi shem ra, metzora. Right? There's a deficiency, there's a defectiveness. And so when we learn about these topics and the unkosher traits, we're learning that externally Nadav and Avihu appear kosher. They're kohanim, but eternally they were treif. So the Torah is trying to give us a lesson here. Yes, there's a lesson in keeping the mitzvot of the Torah, the law of the written, the letter of the law, but also the spirit of the law as well. It's one thing to eat kosher. And trust me, you can eat all the kosher food in the world and still be basically unkosher inside. Because it's all about attitude. So with that said, what we learn here in Parashat Shemini, which is why I labeled it based off of the words of the Rebbe, the vindication of the pig. Eventually, every one of us who acts as a chazer is guaranteed to be vindicated by Hashem, because when we're willing to face that insidious nature within us, Hashem is willing to reciprocate. He's willing to kosher that treif from out of us. But in order for that to happen, we have to be willing to face that pig within. We have to look at that ugliness within. And we have to say, okay, I'm here to rectify the damage. And once we do that, Hashem will rectify, and the pig will be vindicated. The complete Messianic era is a vindication of Am Israel from their Esav-type personality that they have basically succumbed to by getting shrouded in the klipa of Edom. Not the religion, but the system of Edom. And so with that said, Chavarim, that's going to bring us to an end of our teaching here for Parashat Shemini. And if you have been blessed by our teachings and are blessed, prayerfully consider supporting us financially. You can find the links right below the video. They take you to our website, or you can donate via PayPal. If you would like to send a check or money order in, you can find the address on our website. We greatly appreciate your financial support. It enables us to continue to put these teachings together. So thank you. Thank you for your prayers. And if you have any questions regarding the topic here, the Torah portion, feel free to send me an email. I will get to those in the answer in the order that they arrive in. So other Fnei Chavarim, until next time, may the God of Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov bless you and your families. Shalom and Kol Tov.